Ever since I made a video about my past adventures with mechanical keyboards, I've received dozens of requests from keyboard companies offering to send me their products in exchange for a video, all of which I've declined as I wasn't interested in most of the products, nor in making keyboard reviews, except for the Lofree Flow, which I did accept and did make a video about, and I recommend you go watch it for additional context that can give you a better sense of what I'll be focusing on in this review as well. I made that review over half a year ago, yet still to this day, I occasionally keep receiving emails from keyboard companies requesting me to review their keyboards, including this one from Keychron, and since the keyboard they offered seemed somewhat acceptable, I figured that perhaps I can use it as an opportunity to practice making a freestyle live commentary type review with my new camera and putting it on my second channel, which Keychron agreed to. But the moment I received the keyboard, I noticed how heavy the box was, which made me think that this might actually be a pretty good quality product, considering it only costs around $100 to $130 depending on the configuration, so I decided I'll make a fully fledged review on my main channel instead. Now, just to once again clarify, this is not a paid review, and this channel isn't about reviewing keyboards, which means that I also don't rely on keyboard companies sending me products, nor do I even want to sacrifice other videos I have planned in order to review keyboards all the time, so I genuinely do not care if I say something that will make no other company want to work with me in the future. In fact, how about this? If you already have a keyboard that you like, how about you don't buy any new keyboard at all and instead make use of the one that you currently have? I've been using this beat-up 20-year-old HHKB Pro 1 with a cracked case that was horribly spray-painted 3 times by the previous owner, and it occasionally even has issues with the USB port, yet it's still my favorite keyboard of all time that I feel like no other keyboard can match, both in terms of layout and feel, which is why I've been using it for years and have no plans on replacing it. Moreover, if you still feel like you really need to buy another keyboard, there is an abundance of choice on second-hand keyboard marketplaces as well, with prices that are much cheaper than brand new, as nowadays the keyboard scene is so inflated with new products that people need to lower their prices if they actually want to sell something. So anyway, let's get on with the review, starting from the unboxing, and find out whether or not this keyboard can overthrow my HHKB. The box it came in was definitely pretty nice and solid, and like I said, it felt really heavy, meaning that the keyboard itself was probably the thing that was really heavy, so the packaging has to be strong enough to protect it from any faults during shipping. But I think there should be no issues with that, because when I opened it up and moved the really handy quick start manual out the way, I was greeted with a really thick foam padding that I'll definitely be reusing for other purposes in the future as well. Then you had a huge card warning you to make sure the pins are aligned and not bent when installing switches, another handy manual so you wouldn't have to go online to search for instructions, especially in the future if the sites go offline, and then there was also an included screwdriver, which was a really nice surprise in the case you want to open up the keyboard. Then you also had a bunch of extra keycaps for some of the modifier and accent keys that you can see are nicely double shot, despite being PBT, a keycap cum switch puller, a packet of these rubber thingies that says Nijudo on it, and I wasn't really sure what they were for at first, but I figured they're related to the gasket mount, so I asked Keychron, and indeed, these 20-degree gasket mount silicone grains are there so you could customize the firmness of the gasket mount of this keyboard, for it comes pre-built with 50-degree gaskets, which are supposedly firmer than the 20-degree ones, which I'll be trying out later in the video. Then you also had a Type A and C extension adapter, which is really nice to have because you can use it for other purposes as well. A color-matched braided USB A to C cable, which isn't as flexible as the cable on my cheap DeathAdder Mini, but it's still decently soft and flexible, definitely acceptable, and a huge improvement over the cable included with the Lofree Flow, for example. And it also has a ferrite bead designed to reduce signal interference. And finally, you have a tiny USB wireless receiver, and the way you're supposed to use it is that you take the included extension adapter and plug the receiver into one end and the included cable into the other, and put it somewhere close to your keyboard to ensure the lowest latency and interference, which is why the USB cable also includes the ferrite bead. And now we're left with just the keyboard. And this was my first reaction when lifting it out of the box.
This is really heavy.
Indeed, this keyboard is genuinely very heavy. It weighs around 1.7 kilos, making it the heaviest keyboard that I've ever used despite its semi-compact 75% layout. There was no doubt that the case was made out of metal, and the overall construction of it was pretty much perfect. Nothing was misaligned, and even on the bottom, all the gaps connecting the case were uniform. The case did have a bit of dirt straight out of the box, which I was able to wipe off, but it also had two very tiny dents on the bottom rim, which luckily aren't visible unless you flip the keyboard and go looking for them. However, I hope that someone won't receive the keyboard with the dents on the top. The keycaps are double-shot PBT with a decent amount of thickness, and they feature the same font as my old Enjoy PBT ones, which I don't mind at all, and they have a very fine grainy texture to the extent that at first it reminded me of soft touch plastic. I'd also like to mention that the tealish accent keys looked nicer in real life than I expected. It kind of reminds me of the whole ordeal with the old, original, extremely expensive GMK Triumph Adler keycaps, which people said were hard to take pictures of because the bluish accent colors never looked right on photos. Like I said, it also included a bunch of bonus keycaps, so you can either remove or even add more accents and so on. I also found it funny that it included an R/M key keycap in the year 2024, in the case you'd like to be stamped a Redditor. This was also the first keyboard I had ever used which had a knob, and I was surprised that instead of being linear, it was tactile in the sense that it snaps on every input. It's a bit heavy, but you can also click it, so it serves as an extra button as well. However, the knob is also where my first real complaint with this keyboard comes in. The cover of the knob is rather loose and wobbly, which you can feel from the moment you touch it. Usually, knobs on things such as audio interfaces are incredibly dialed, and considering how solid the rest of the keyboard is, the cap of the knob being loose and wobbly is such a sharp contrast that I was wondering whether or not it's supposed to actually be like that, or if it was broken. But since you can also remove the cap, I assume that that's just how it is. It's still fun to fiddle around with though. Now it was time to finally try typing on this keyboard for the very first time, and this is what it sounded like. As you can probably hear, while bottoming out sounds somewhat hollow, it still has a level of high pitch that you might expect from heavy-duty keyboards with linears that are not gasket mounted, and indeed, the gasket mount of this keyboard seems to be rather stiff, so bottoming out still feels surprisingly harsh. For example, both the HSKB as well as the Lofree Flow feel softer, or I guess tuckier in the literal sense of the word, aka on those keyboards you can feel the plate slightly reverberating as it diffuses the impact of bottoming out way more than you can on this keyboard despite it being gasket mounted and regular profile. But that's exactly where the included extra gaskets come in. After around a week of using this keyboard with the out-of-the-box configuration, I decided to open it up and swap out the default 50-degree gaskets for the 20-degree ones, which was a rather tedious process due to how many layers of padding and things that can get misaligned there are within the keyboard, but at the same time, I found it pretty exotic and interesting, especially when it came to the plate. Indeed, the default 50-degree gaskets were much stiffer than the included 20-degree ones, swapping out which took a bit of time. I also had a bit of trouble getting it all back together because something just felt misaligned, and indeed, the ribbon cable was in the way and I had to push it more inside the crevice. So if you feel like you need to use strength to force this keyboard back together, then something is probably off and you might negate the effects of the gasket mount, so you need to be really careful. Once the swap was done, I was immediately able to feel a subtle difference with these new gaskets, both in terms of sound and feel. and honestly, I was a bit conflicted at first, as I felt like it took so much time to switch them out, and I might have preferred the previous ones more. But honestly, after using the software gaskets for a while, they really started to grow on me. When typing fast and hard, the added quote-unquote bounciness slightly reminds me of the HSKB, despite this keyboard being MX-based and linear. That being said, the difference these new gaskets make is still really subtle. It's not really a night and day difference, and I assume that if you secretly switched out the gaskets for a day for someone actually using this keyboard, they might not even notice. However, something I don't understand is why are the switches of this keyboard this scratchy? If you listen closely, you can even pretty much hear the scratchiness. Now, overall, they are still relatively smooth, but the reason I find them surprisingly scratchy is because these are the first switches I've ever used that are lubed, yet the smoothness of them feels like an in-between of a stock Cherry MX Red and a first generation Gator Black. Perhaps there just isn't enough lube, or maybe the stem material is a bit too rough, or maybe they just haven't worn in yet, but that will take a very long time and will be inconsistent across different keys. However, at least these switches aren't the worst when it comes to the quote-unquote steppiness issue, also known as stiction. The force curve is definitely on the flatter side due to the switches using a two-stage spring, which I quite like. However, as they're linear, I imagine that I'd personally prefer if they were just a little bit lighter. But luckily, since this board is hot swappable, you can easily swap out the switches, so perhaps in the future I can finally try out the Akko switches I bought around a year ago, but was never able to use. All that being said though, overall I do like the way this keyboard feels. It's definitely satisfying to type on, despite knowing that it would be even better if the switches were a bit smoother. Though, looking back at it, the Lofree Flow was also a surprisingly good feeling keyboard except for the stiction issue, but if I had to choose one, I'd personally still go with my HSKB Pro 1, both for the feel as well as the layout. Speaking of the layout, it features these caps that should help you distinguish between the alphanumeric cluster and the navigation cluster. However, since this keyboard does not feature a numpad, you can clearly tell that your hand is on the navigation cluster whenever it's on the edge of the keyboard. So personally, I feel like these caps unnecessarily increase the distance between the keys, forcing your hand to move more than it should, and also making the footprint of the keyboard a bit larger. Visually, these caps can definitely be nice, especially considering the border, but in terms of practicality, I'd rather see the caps removed, the side column moved a row down, and the knob put straight next to the F keys, which would also make it a bit easier to use as well, as it would be more within reach. I'm also not the biggest fan of the default key mappings, but luckily that's no problem at all, because unlike Lofree Flow, this keyboard is fully programmable, featuring QMK firmware, and it also has the best key remapping software I've ever used, as it's entirely browser-based, meaning that you don't even need to download anything, and it also makes it fully cross-platform. The software also includes a huge amount of remappings that you can choose from, and you don't even need to flash your firmware or anything like that, as you can just click a key and choose a new mapping, and that's it. Not only can you also remap the function key, but you can even assign multiple function keys and have multiple layers, which also applies to the knob, to which you can also assign whatever functionality you prefer. Personally, I would like the ability to set up different profiles that you can easily switch between, or at least a way to export and import your configuration in the case you share the keyboard with others or would like different bindings depending on whatever you're doing, which could be especially useful if you're using the knob for some specific purpose during, for example, video editing. Of course, since the keyboard has gaming in its name, it has RGB as well, which I usually don't really care for, but I found this one profile that had these kind of pastel marshmallow colors, and I actually kinda started liking it because it reminds me of some old Christmas lights, which I find a bit nostalgic, as well as those old school marshmallow palm keycap style keyboards, and it fits the color scheme of this keyboard surprisingly well as well. When it comes to wireless connectivity, it has a regular Bluetooth mode and a 2.4 GHz quote-unquote gaming mode, which essentially has very low latency, and sure enough, after trying it out extensively, I can vouch that it feels the same as wired. However, when I tested it with the receiver connected to behind my PC, I occasionally started getting buggy inputs, so just like the manual says, it's a good idea to put the receiver somewhere near the keyboard instead. The battery has quite a large capacity, so it lasts for quite a while as well, even on the 2.4 GHz mode with RGB enabled. So after having used this keyboard for around 2 weeks, I realized that there are a few things which make it slightly difficult for me to use. namely the weight and the form factor. Now, I've always wanted a keyboard with a thick, solid, heavy metal case like this, but I am also someone who constantly moves around and slides their keyboard as I adjust my posture, which is a bit hard to do with this 2 kilo brick, even if I put something like a towel beneath it. That's also a part of the reason why I'd much prefer to have a fully compact layout such as the one on the HSKB, my handwire board, or the Lofree Flow. Not only do I find said layouts more practical and comfortable to use, but they also take up less space on my desk, giving me more room to adjust the position of my keyboard without the risk of bumping my mouse into the keyboard if I end up having them too close to one another. I also tend to rest my hand on the edge of the keyboard a lot, and I noticed that this thick bezel feels surprisingly sharp on my hand, once again making the keyboard slightly less comfortable to use. But that being said, I still absolutely love the weight and the solid design of this metallic case, and I don't think those things need to be changed as they're a matter of preference, but they are just aspects I noticed that have a practical drawback for myself personally. Overall, this keyboard isn't necessarily anything revolutionary. There isn't much else I'd like to say about it, so in conclusion, I think the Keychron Lemokey P1 Pro is very well built, except for the wobbly knob, feels fun to use and decent to type on, except for the slightly scratchy switches, has a wide variety of desirable features, ranging from the included screwdriver to the 2.4 GHz wireless mode, and all in all, for $130, I think it offers pretty decent value. However, that price does not include shipping, which is going to be another $15 to $30-ish, and that's still an additional price you have to pay, regardless of whether or not it's part of the keyboard itself. So whether or not it's going to be worth it for yourself personally is entirely up to you to decide. For myself personally, despite this keyboard having a lot going for it, and despite the fact that I do enjoy using it, I doubt that it will become a permanent daily driver for me, already from the fact that I still find it a bit less practical and a bit less comfortable to use compared to the HSKB, the aged Tobre domes of which also feel very satisfying to type on. Though I can definitely imagine myself still using this keyboard from time to time just to switch things up a bit. Ironically, this made me kind of realize the things I value in a keyboard, which is why I'm suddenly curious if there's some incredibly lightweight, low latency wireless programmable keyboard with a layout and form factor that I'd actually like, and whether or not it could rival the HSKB, because almost daily I move my keyboard out the way when I do things such as reviews or drawing practice, in which case the keyboard being light and wireless could come in handy. Moreover, I'm just wondering how smooth MX-based switches can get, because ironically, despite the scratchiness, the switches on the Lemokey P1 are still some of the smoothest MX-based switches I've tried, so there's no way that that's as good as it gets, right? Well, anyway, that's all for this review, and here is the final sound comparison of this keyboard.